Thank you, Maria. That is the nicest introduction I have ever heard, and I feel like I can just walk out of here floating on clouds. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come here tonight to speak with you all. I had a look at the previous list of Alan Martin lecturers, and it's quite a distinguished company that I find myself in, so it's a great honour. Thanks also to Paul, who might have left, quite entitled to do so, for his welcome to country. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and acknowledge them as traditional owners on the lands of which we are gathered here tonight. It feels appropriate to be making these acknowledgements and a lecture about history making and storying this place, this country, and acknowledge that, of course, histories have been made here and stories have been told about this place for thousands of years. My grandma Dimphna, who was a member of the Aboriginal Treaty Committee when it started, was a passionate believer in this. And while I did want to sort of silently slink out of the room when you mentioned my family, it did spark a memory, a very strong memory I have as a young girl when I came to visit my grandparents in Canberra. She would always take me down to the tent embassy. And so it's important to say, you know, to make that acknowledgement that histories have been told about this place for thousands of years, and they continue. And the question we might be asking now is not what histories were told, but who was listening and when. And I guess that's what the sort of content of my lecture will be tonight. When the Australian philosopher of history, Marnie Hughes-Warrington, published the second edition of her historiographical reference guide, 50 Key Thinkers on History, in 2008, the shape of historiography had become much less clear in the settler colonies. For you, she wrote, history may imply the chronological arrangement of phenomena. For an Aboriginal storyteller in Northern Australia, on the other hand, historical figures that lived hundreds of years apart may be brought together to stress the moral and social significance of a place. An important challenge for historiographers is to figure out how to respond to these differences. Are they superficial differences that mask an underlying common idea of history? That's the challenge that I want to come back to tonight. For those of us who study Australian historiography, that's the body of work written about Australian history, it's a question that's increasingly pressed on our research and interpretation. Since the 1960s and 70s, following waves of activist campaigns for Indigenous land rights and civil rights, the imperative to acknowledge Indigenous historical perspectives in Australia has become central to its history. Yet that acknowledgement has not been uncomplicated. Indigenous histories of country, encompassing land, sea and sky, stretch into deep time, long before a recognisable form of empirical history existed. And Indigenous histories are still largely produced outside the academy, as Hughes-Warrington's quote intimates. Given that successive colonial and national histories excluded First Nations perspectives for the better part of 2 centuries in Australia, their relatively recent inclusion has raised all sorts of historiographical questions, such as, when does Australian history begin? I'll let that sit with you for a while. What are the methodological boundaries of the discipline? How do we map it? Where does it belong? And crucially, who is a historian? Moreover, the role of the history discipline as part of the architecture of colonisation has become more visible and better understood. This disciplinary intervention and critique reflects foundational shifts in historical practice and theory prompted by transdisciplinary and transnational scholarship in fields such as post-colonial and settler colonial studies, First Nations knowledges and historical perspectives and practices contextualised by transatlantic slavery. Admittedly, this is a really broad, capacious, diverse field, several of them in fact, and they reflect research that has been conducted over many, many decades across continents and across contexts. But what brings them together is a shared recognition that the history discipline is far from neutral. Archives built to record colonial pasts silence others. History renders only certain authorised practitioners visible, excluding those who don't meet defined qualifications of expertise, and concepts of historical truth and objectivity can omit First Nations and subaltern historical perspectives. History, that Western empirical discipline based on rules of evidence and expertise, not only studied the past, but storied the settler colonies like Australia with versions of the past that adhered to particular understandings of historical progress, authority and significance. Histories and historical perspectives which sat outside those conceptualisations were excluded from accounts of the past and definitions of what is history itself. Given that historiographical erasure, Hughes Warrington's question isn't simply an issue of definition, but an ethical challenge for historiographers in Australia and beyond. If academic research has a long, shameful history of compounding the evils of colonialism, as a First Nations historian Philip J. Deloria has noted, then the issue of responding to that erasure is vital for the field. Yet responses vary from place to place and from history to history. As Michelle Roth-Trujillo has suggested, any historical narrative is a particular bundle of silences, the result of a unique process, and the operation required to deconstruct these silences will vary accordingly. Following from Trujillo, this talk attempts to trace that historiographical process of reckoning in Australia over the last 50 years. Using the Australian anthropologist WEH Stanner's celebrated 1968 Boyle lectures as a starting point, really a jumping off point, where he coined the term the Great Australian Silence. It maps the emergence of a disciplinary critique in Australian historiography. That critique began as a radical revision, but has since become widely accepted and deployed. It also revealed the discipline's fraught complicity in the settler colonial project for the way it excluded Indigenous histories and perspectives from the national story. The history discipline excluded. Inseparable from that critique was the ethical demand then to fill in Australia's historical silences, from within the discipline but also outside it, by a chorus of Indigenous and non-Indigenous writers, knowledge holders and historians. Their interventions can be seen in the context of wider critical historiographical engagement by Stanner, but also by others. They were also grounded in long-standing Indigenous forms of protest, counter-narrative and history-making that extended back centuries to the earliest days of the settler colony's own histories. Finally, I'd like to contemplate the implications of this historical revision. While huge disciplinary shifts have occurred and continue to play out, the consequences of these epistemological and ethical interventions into settler colonial historiography are still very much unresolved in Australia. Where are we going? Where might this end up? As Trujillo indicated, each narrative has its own particular bundle of silences. Australia's historical gaps were perhaps no more exceptional than other settler colonial contexts around the world, yet the concept of silence has become central to the way its historiography has become understood in recent decades. As in many settler colonial states around the world, historians in Australia have increasingly grappled with acknowledging that their discipline has been foundational to the colonisation of Indigenous peoples, policing whose stories can be told and how. Indigenous histories and historians were largely excluded from Australian historiography until the latter decades of the 20th century. Since then, calls for their inclusion and recognition have radically shifted disciplinary understandings, pushing the timeline of Australian history into the deep past and challenging the profession to engage with Indigenous temporalities, knowledges and forms of history making. At the same time, this national context has also been generated by international movements of ideas and historical approaches. Just as Western empirical historical practice was shipped around the world from the Enlightenment onwards, restoring places in Europe's vast empires, those same shipping lanes of ideas have also facilitated vital transnational movements and passage of post-colonial and decolonising narratives and methods. Tracing this historiographical period of intervention and revision in Australia reveals important shifts, from a politics of inclusion to a growing acknowledgement that, as well as being central to overcoming its own silences, the history discipline is perhaps still part of the problem. For this audience in particular, I probably don't need to re-emphasise the significance of anthropologist WEH Stanner's now renowned 1968 Boyer Lectures. I feel like they echo in the buildings of this place. He coined the term, of course, the Great Australian Silence in the lectures to describe how, following an initial brief period of cross-cultural curiosity at the very beginnings of colonial Australia, along with ethnological interest, after that, Indigenous history and culture were increasingly written out of Australia's settler colonial narratives. Critically, Australians' disdain of Indigenous histories was not simply a consequence of colonisation, but part of the colonial project, he wrote in 1963 in an essay titled "The History of Indifference Thus Begins." There was more than an accidental correspondence between the ruin of Aboriginal and the making of European life in Australia. There was, in fact, a functional concomitance. Stanner sharpened that historical critique in his Boyer Lectures. Australia's sense of its past, its collective historical consciousness, had been built on a pattern of forgetting that was more than simple accident. It is a structural matter, he wrote, a view from a window which has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of the landscape. Stanner not only traced the outlines of that historical silence in Australian historiography, he also understood the discipline's contribution to Australia's colonisation and articulated its disciplinary architecture of both remembering and forgetting. What may well have begun as a simple forgetting of other possible views turned under habit and over time into something like a cult of forgetfulness practised on a national scale. It's probably hard for most of us to imagine now, given the ubiquity of Stanner's phrase, but at the time, the originality and power of his assessment was really significant. Stanner's lectures reveal an emerging critical perspective on Australian historiography was apparent in 1968, but only just. Overwhelmingly, Australian historical writing simply overlooked the continent's Indigenous history at that time. Partly that omission was disciplinary. From the late 19th century, history's increasingly scientific focus on objectivity, evidence, and source criticism meant that Indigenous modes of history making, mostly non-textual, often in a language other than English, produced and archived in communities rather than by professionals, and without the temporality of a strict historical chronology, were excluded from the emerging field of Australian historiography. As Chris Lorenz has noted, scientific history's focus was aspirational and ideological, at once an epistemic and an ethical ideal. Yet the effects of this pursuit of objectivity meant that forms of history making and historical archives outside the discipline's increasingly reified and prescribed modes of scholarship were excluded from its practice. Stanner had intimated that the silence of Indigenous people in Australian history was structural. They simply didn't fit the logic of scientific history's evidence or significance. It was hardly unique to Australia, but it was really powerful here as well. Critically, it was the discipline's increasing alignment with nationalism and national identity that further relegated Indigenous people's experiences and perspectives outside official national narratives in the settler colonies. Persuasive forms of national exceptionalism that emerged during the 19th century, especially in Europe, the UK and North America, as Mark Bevier has explained, were intimately entwined with the professionalisation of the discipline. A classic national history narrates the formation and progress of a nation-state as a reflection of principles such as national character, liberty, progress, and statehood. 19th century Australian historiography was framed at once by an imperial logic that saw colonisation as providential and by a growing nationalism as it moved towards independence through the federation of its 6 colonies in 1901. In the late 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, there was silence about pre- and post-contact First Nations experience because it was seen to exist outside that logic. Colonisation brought history to Australia. Before that, the continent was a blank space on the map, as Ernest Scott's 1916 short history had described. Notably, the relative silence of Indigenous Australia in its colonial and national histories was counterposed against descriptions and depictions, as we can see here in the 1802 watercolour by William Bradley, of the busy, noisy industriousness of the colonisers, who cut down trees, planted crops, explored deserts and built railways, as well as writing the histories that catalogued them all. The contents pages of these texts lay out very clearly how the logics of colonial, national and narrative progress were entangled, plotting out that sequence that many of you might be familiar with in some of these older texts of discovery, exploration, civil, democratic and economic expansion as objective and inevitable. We just look at that sort of teleology of Battia's Western Australia history from 1924. Colonial expansion seems inexorable. Given that historiographical background then, Stanner's idea of the Great Australian Silence really was a watershed intervention. Since their broadcast over 50 years ago, his Boyer lectures have become a defining moment in Australian historiography for scholars and public alike. They were reprinted 7 times, and they continue to frame the ways Australian historians describe the discipline's growing realisation, being smacked in the face, that it had not simply been a storyteller, but an agent in the nation's settler colonial history. The endurance of his metaphor of silence has been so powerful, I think, because of the image he captured. If we think of a discipline, when we think of history and historians as, based on diligent documentation, archiving, storytelling, we have a sense of, creating and crafting narratives that explain and elucidate and help us understand who we are. Redrawing and redefining that practice around the idea of a structural, deliberate silence is captivating. And it indicated, I think, a profound reimagining of a national historiography by Stanner, i.e. that Australian historiography doesn't simply tell, it also withholds and excludes. In turn, that idea of silence, not just the silencing, has become arguably as central a frame for Australian historiography as the actual silence, that quadrant Stanner first described in 1968. More than simply a clever conceit or a neat idea, the idea of silence was profound because of its moral dimension. Like Lorenz's analysis of historical objectivity, Stanner's critique of it wasn't simply an analytical tool, but an ethical demand. The Great Australian Silence was something to be understood and overcome as part of a national centring of Indigenous self-determination and civil rights, which was gaining increasing political and public prominence in the 1960s. As Anne Curthoys rightly points out, Indigenous histories were produced following colonisation right through the colonial period. Significant historical narratives were presented in petitions sent to the British Crown in the 19th century, public protests such as the 1938 Day of Mourning, as well as quotidian forms of resistance, refusal and historical revision that were passed down, an example of that famous event, of course, a historical revision that were passed down orally in family and community histories. Not just passed down orally, but passed down faithfully, diligently, and a different form of archival register, you might think. Creative histories were also produced by activists and non-Indigenous allies in the form of historical fiction and poetry, attracting significant public interest and acclaim. In other words, histories were produced by First Nations communities alongside an exercised cohort of critics and activists during what we call the Great Australian Silence. Yet they remained stubbornly outside the formal history discipline until the latter decades of the 20th century. Because of that exclusion, Stanner's brilliant and now iconic phrase, as Curthoys describes it, has become a powerful marker in a longer, complex history of Australian historiography. As well as defining patterns and structures of Australian historiographical omission in his Boyer lectures, Stanner also hinted that they would not continue indefinitely. Aboriginal people, he wrote, having been out of history for so long, for a century and a half, are now coming back into history with a vengeance, he insisted. I hardly think that what I have called the Great Australian Silence will survive the research that is now in course. The research now in course was an infilling of the discipline's historical blanks with testimony, story and experience. This wasn't simply a historical additive, but pointed to shifting methods and approaches. In Aboriginal Australia, there is an oral history which is providing these people with a coherent principle of explanation, Stanner explained. It has a directness and a candour which cut like a knife through most of what we say and write. We would have to bring this material into the sweep of our history. I think it was a really perceptive observation by Stanner, who sensed a growing body of Indigenous histories which took the form of life stories, shared as testimony and oral history, but were also expressed through creative writing. A cohort of Indigenous writers such as Kevin Gilbert, Margaret Tucker, James Miller, Marnie Kennedy and Udguru Nununkel, Kath Walker, gave personal voice to that history making. Their works, at once intimate reflection and searing social commentary, increasingly pressed on the history discipline, pushing it to recognise Indigenous voices and Indigenous modes of history making. The British settlers took our land, the Larrakia petition articulated, alongside the signatures and thumbprints of more than 1,000 Aboriginal people. No treaties were signed with the tribes. Today, we are refugees. While the momentum for land rights was foremost a political movement for Indigenous self-determination, it also offered a really powerful counter-narrative of Australian history that played out in the public sphere and contributed to a broader groundswell of Indigenous perspectives, challenging the nation's apparent progress and highlighting its appalling record in Indigenous rights. The hand-painted sign leaning against the shipping container that housed the Tent Embassy in 1972 was also emblematic of that eviscerating revision. White invaders, you were living on stolen land. It's a political claim, but it's also a really powerful revision of Australian history. The academic fields of Aboriginal history, archaeology, anthropology and linguistics, practiced mostly by non-Indigenous academics, emerged alongside that broader Indigenous historical revision and drew on, often, Indigenous interlocutors and knowledge holders as collaborators whose expertise helped reorient research and interpretation of Australia's past. Works such as Charles Rowley's 3-volume History of Aboriginal Policy were published alongside major works of archaeological and anthropological research that continued to push the occupation of the continent by Indigenous people into the deep past, in addition to foregrounding lived experiences since colonisation. The emergence of radiocarbon dating, first used by D.J. Mulvaney in 1956, gave scientific veracity to Indigenous claims that they had been here since time immemorial, since forever. Who could even think beyond those times? Simultaneously, there was growing interest by archaeologists in the possibility that Indigenous dreaming stories might be used to tell the deep time history of the Australian continent as knowledge holders and archivists, filling in the continent's Indigenous history stretched to pre as well as post-colonisation. These texts and the rapidly expanding research fields they represented reflected a curiosity and inquisitiveness in Indigenous peoples and cultures that Stanner had identified in the very earliest colonial ethnological writings and was re-emerging by the 1970s. Critically, they also demonstrated a scholarly determination to rewrite assumptions that Australian history began with its European discovery, or that the continent had been a blank until then, since it had been walked, mapped, sung, and historied long before any historical text had ever been published in Australia or elsewhere. The first sentence of Mulvaney's field-defining Prehistory of Australia, published in 1969, overturned the traditional opening chapter of Australian history and demonstrated how disciplinary shifts to include Indigenous histories were as much an ethical imperative as an empirical one. the discoverers, explorers and colonists of the 3 million square miles of which are Australia were its Aborigines, he wrote. By 1976, when Henry Reynolds wrote an article in Historical Studies that sought to reposition understandings of the colonial frontier to include its effects on Indigenous peoples, it was clear that as history's revision of the Australian settler colony was becoming more widely accepted. The investigation of the Aboriginal response to settlement is just beginning, Reynolds explained, yet already the inadequacies of traditional historiography are apparent. That his article was just the first to engage with Aboriginal history and historiography in the Australian discipline's flagship journal following Stanner's Boyer lecture 10 years earlier demonstrates the unevenness of what I have described as Australian history's infilling. It didn't just happen. It didn't just go underway. Yet it's also an indication that the field of Aboriginal history was expanding nonetheless. In 1977, the establishment of the Aboriginal History Journal at the ANU, and the publication of an important bibliography of Aboriginal research in its second issue also confirmed that the history discipline was being increasingly influenced by shifting politics of Indigenous rights and recognition. That growing clamour of Indigenous histories and voices was critical and influential in Australian historiography, but it was hardly isolated. Such interventions were part of a broader global movement of disciplinary and social change. Demands for civil rights and women's rights, along with movements for decolonisation and anti-apartheid, prompted major rereadings of national histories around the world, especially perspectives which had been left out. Historians drew increasingly on diverse methods to capture traditionally overlooked historical experiences, such as the working classes, women, children, queer people, the colonised and the institutionalised. Historical subjects who made up history's non-discursive, to use Judith Allen's memorable critique of the discipline. People who didn't write and leave texts that we might include in a concept known as historiography. But were they history makers? In an attempt to populate history with vernacular narratives and voices, these approaches included oral histories, journals and scrapbooks, as well as studies of folklore, protest, song and poetry to help articulate the lives of classes and social groups which had previously been overlooked by conventional empirical national histories. Women's history, labour history and subaltern history, along with histories of slavery, sexuality and childhood, all contributed to that broader revision. Admittedly, aggregating all of these wide-ranging fields of research into a single historiographical revisionist movement risks collapsing nuances in their historical, cultural and geographical contexts. The influence of labour history on subaltern studies and women's history, for example, was significant on those emerging fields. In turn, subaltern studies and women's history prompted really important historiographical critiques of and shifts in labour history. Furthermore, women's history was instrumental in the inclusion of Indigenous histories in Australian historiography, yet that alliance was also strongly critiqued by Indigenous historians, who argued forcefully that white feminists were also complicit in the subjugation of Indigenous people in Australia. For Indigenous women, all white feminists benefit from colonisation, as Gurnpool scholar Eileen Morton-Robinson insisted. Pressing claims from Indigenous people and people of colour rightly contended that white women could be perpetrators of body policing, injustice and intervention, as well as victims of it. Feminist history might have begun as a global fight for women's historical recognition and inclusion, but it wasn't immune to the discipline's own structures of authority, power and exclusion. As well as being controlled and surveilled themselves, white women also policed others. They removed babies as well as bearing their own. They demanded voting rights and political representation by justifying the exclusion of others. And they wrote, often history, while excluding others. As the magistrate and Aboriginal activist Pat O'Shane implored in 1976, sexism wasn't the system that subjugated Aboriginal women, but it was racism. The term intersectionality hadn't been coined yet, but it was playing out in real time in Australian historical revision in the 1970s. Taken together, these fields produced a moment, I think, of vital, vibrant historical revision in Australia. Furthermore, the practices, the methods they collectively refined fundamentally reoriented history in Australia, such that life storying, oral history and folklore became increasingly important in Australian historiography. And they were increasingly critical to the discipline's reluctant, or belated, I should say, acceptance of First Nations oral historical culture. A collection edited by Graham Osborne and Bill Mandel, for example, auspiciously titled New History, included a chapter on Aboriginal history, alongside contributions on women's history, labour history, and talking history, the use of oral sources. All this is to say that Stanner's anticipation of radical disciplinary change in Australian historiography was prescient. Critically, this historiographical filling in was framed as an ethical imperative in which the growing politics of inclusion extended to the nation's history. Historians had begun responding to what Bain Attwood has described as the disturbing psychological, moral and political implications that this history was raising. There was a sense that Australia's Indigenous past was exerting pressure on the national conscience, again, that call to ethical demands, as the historian Bob Rees described in a survey of Australian Aboriginal history in 1979. And in turn, he noted the role of historians in sharing that growing consciousness with the broader public. While historians inevitably reflect contemporary social attitudes, they can also belong to an intellectual community whose efforts may challenge and help to change those attitudes. Indigenous perspectives that increasingly swelled Australian histories from the 1970s produced significant historical content and pushed urgently at the accepted boundaries of method and practice. Those perspectives were often harrowing and revealed histories of frontier violence, childhoods removed from families and communities, of lives on missions and reserves where Indigenous culture and language were constantly regulated. Critically, they also exposed the history discipline for being complicit in the curation of whose stories got told and who could tell them. Stanner had argued in his Boyer lectures that silence was inseparable from colonisation itself. Over time, historians mapped out that legacy of colonisation and, increasingly, the agency of the history discipline's collusion with the colonial project. The undisputed, enduring presence of Indigenous people in their history making exposed the structures which had colonised not only the continent, but its past. History was more than simply a discipline that contained silences. It also enacted a silencing in which First Nations people were rendered sort of historyless, as Lorenzo Veracini and Janine Lean have evocatively defined. That erasure and omission manifested in the occlusion of Indigenous perspectives, the insistence that Australian history began with colonisation, and the frequently euphemistic descriptions of actual colonial violence in history texts. Australia's forgetting was a violent task of memory work, as Chris Healy has contended. In a special issue of History and Theory, Warwick Anderson also described that complicity of the discipline in the colonial project as a sort of epistemic violence. Alongside this growing critical reading of history, Indigenous voices continued to push and prod at the methodological and temporal boundaries of the discipline as an ethical demand. They were hardly new registers. Indigenous forms of history making had evolved over thousands of years, yet their growing prominence within the discipline continued to prompt radical shifts in its practice by including concepts such as deep time, archives and histories that are embodied and held on country, and insisting on new categories of evidence and authorship of who is a historian. After all, before history was written, it was told and sung, Diana James reflected in her collaboration with Nanincha, a Pitjantjatjara woman who described her historical texts in those terms exactly. We have no books. Our country was not written by people with pen and paper. It is in the land. The footprints of our creation ancestors are on the rocks. The hills and creek beds they created as they dwelled in this land surround us. We learnt from our grandmothers and grandfathers as they showed us these historic sites, sacred sites, told us the stories, sang and danced with us the chukurpa, the dreaming law. We remember it all. In our minds, our bodies and feet as we dance the stories, we continually recreate the chukurpa. Her description of history making is about as far from empirical history as you might get. And yet, as James rightly suggests, not recognising that historical practice or expertise in an Australian historiographical context risks further colonisation. Accounts of Indigenous history making and temporality from other parts of the country, such as John Bradley's long-standing partnership with the Yanyuwa people and the Yolngu-led Gayu group of women, similarly reveal the creative challenges, but also the possibilities of Indigenous historical translation. Take the Gayu group's explanation of song spirals, for example, which describes a way of reading the Yolngu world that is at once historical, cartographical and cosmological. Song spirals are infinite, they describe. They spiral, connecting and remaking. They twist and turn, they move and loop. This is like all our songs. Our songs are not a straight line. They do not move in one direction through time and space. They are a map we follow through country as they connect to other clans. Everything is connected, layered with beauty. In other words, academic historians are not the only ones producing and maintaining history, as Minoru Hukari contended. During his research, where he spent time living with the Gurindji people in far northern Australia, Hukari was struck by modes of history making that are perhaps impossible to translate into Western historical practice. And yet, he added, echoing Hughes Warrington's contemplation of Aboriginal history making that opened this lecture, historians must urgently engage with them nonetheless. For First Nations historians working at the intersection of disciplinary history and Indigenous knowledges in Australia, that tension between history's ethical obligation to decolonise and the challenge of that task is a constant pressing theme. In a recent article on creative histories, UN historian and museum curator Mariko Smith admitted that history and historians have become a bit of a dirty word or dirty concept in the First Nations context. Work by First Nations historians, curators, writers and creative practitioners such as Nathan Sentence, Alison Whitaker, Larissa Berent, Tony Birch and Janine Lean and many others, some of whom are in this room, offer important insight into how history might contemplate these challenges of disciplinary decolonisation. Their work, vibrant, creative and critical, occupies an increasingly powerful yet ill-defined place in Australian historiography, in the discipline. History, writes Lean, occupies only a slim layer in Aboriginal memory and time, and yet the discipline made for the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples by removing us from Western historical time. Indigenous hyphenated histories, as the Aotearoa New Zealand historian Miranda Johnson calls them, employ creative methods, life stories and linguistic diversity. While they represent a radical disciplinary break from history, even perhaps a repudiation of capital H history, she notes that they also have the capacity to extend the discipline into those spaces and stories that were previously out of reach. This is more than just history, as Krim Benterak, Stephen Mukey and Galarabaloo elder Paddy Rowe insist. Within the issue of Aboriginal sovereignty, there is more at stake than the use of lands. There is the right to control the production of Australia's mythologies, the national story, our nation's history. Could First Nations interventions in Australian history shift settler colonial entitlement as well as its narratives? Again, pushing into this sense of ethics rather than just content. That question, like much Indigenous historiography, is simultaneously grounded in place while also reflecting a dynamic transnational exchange of historical practice and ideas. First Nations scholars, creatives and activists have impelled critiques of empirical history to the forefront of settler colonial historiography and theory around the world. This is, of course, a really diverse cohort of research and researchers, but it's also built from a shared frustration with the relegation of Indigenous pasts to footnotes in the histories of empires. in Epeli Hauofa's noted intervention. This diverse body of First Nations historiography has created new ways of doing history, new choreographies, to borrow from Hauofa once more, that recentre Indigenous experience. That recentering of Indigenous history enabled vital counter-histories to be produced and circulated in the settler colonies. Their work has been voluminous in every sense of the word, retrieving silenced voices and shifting the dial to recognise new ones to overcome what Dipesh Chakrabarty has called history's inbuilt inequalities. Critically, argues Birch, in a nod to Stanner's lectures from half a century earlier, the vital thing is the volume dial itself. Fiction can be an empowering way of understanding the past, as can visual culture, as can academic history, he insists. The greatest threat to recognition, in this case the recognition of both Indigenous histories of Australia and the at times difficult terrain of colonial history, is silence, absence. Because for many Indigenous history makers, the discipline's capacity to silence and exclude is still active in the present. Indigenous historians remain vastly underrepresented in university history departments, and while Indigenous perspectives have increasingly revised historical approaches and they have become vital and prominent examples of Australian historical culture, they're still often relegated, I think, to genres of memoir or story or family history or narratives of place or political protest, rather than acknowledged as a core of disciplinary practice. Those hyphens can be really generative, but they can still relegate. With the possible exception of oral history and the concept of deep time, I think there's actually still a marked absence of Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous historical epistemologies in Australia's historical canon. If we think of the great historians of Australia, how many of them are Indigenous and where might they fit? Ultimately, I argue that in addition to that growing cohort of hyphenated histories, settler colonies like Australia also need hyphenated historiographies, which can listen to and contemplate diverse Indigenous voices on their own terms. It's a challenge, but I also think that the alternative, i.e. not taking it up, is so much worse. Because the fact that the recent Indigenous-led Uluru Statement from the Heart demanded a truth-telling about Australia's Indigenous history is absolutely evidence that the silences are still felt. Thank you.